40k is a game with quite a lot going on and lots of things to think about. Today we're going to focus on a few basic rules errors that I often see people getting wrong in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I just felt like making a quick video on a few rules that I've seen people get wrong a few times over 9th edition. Obviously 40k is a really massive game, there's a lot going on in the core mechanics alone, let alone the subtleties of plenty of the armies. So today I thought we'd just focus in on a few areas that have come up recently for me, and I can see why they sometimes have the potential to confuse, with Games Workshop's rules not always being absolutely crystal clear. I'm sure there's plenty of other examples of slightly more obscure rules that newer players might not grasp quite as easily, so by all means, if you can think of anything else that's worth talking about, let me know down in the comments below. If I see anything that's interesting enough, I might well make another video along the same lines at some point. In any case, let's just focus on these three areas today, explain the rules and why they can sometimes cause confusion, to hopefully help people avoid any misunderstandings or misplays when they're actually in game. First up is something that I've had to correct people on a few times lately, and that's command rerolls and how they can only apply to some very specific roles within 40k now, whereas in 8th edition they were really quite de-restricted and good for use on all sorts of different other things. I think that this one really does have potential to catch people who are playing 8th edition out. In 9th edition you can still use command rerolls for most of the things that you'd often want to, things like damage rolls, saving throws, charge rolls, psychic tests, but quite a lot of the things that you might previously have wanted to command reroll, you now can't. Here's the full list of the things that you can command point reroll these days: hits, wounds, damage results, saving throws, advanced rolls, charge rolls, psychic tests and deny the witch, and the number of attacks that a weapon makes. I'd also note that it's very slightly different to 8th edition, where you could just reroll one dice out of, say, a charge roll, keep the highest number on the dice, and then try and fish for something better with the other dice. Now you have to reroll the whole thing, and it's the same with psychic tests or deny the witch. Here are a few of the things that I've seen people try and command reroll when they're not technically allowed to anymore, and perhaps one of the easiest ones to get tripped up on is when you generate the number of mortal wounds with something. Say for example, if you smite the enemy and roll a 1, you might well want to command reroll that, as it feels very like a damage roll, but technically it isn't as per the book. The damage roll is a defined thing, and smite just gives you a rule that generates d3 mortal wounds on the target. It's the same for things like vehicle explosions. If you roll low for damaging an enemy unit, you're no longer allowed to reroll the number of mortal wounds that hands out to the foe. I kind of feel that this might be a little bit of needless confusion really. It might be simpler if they were allowed, but it seems that they're not at the moment. Kind of important if your opponent tries to do that on, say, a super smite result of a 1, that could save you a lot of mortal wounds for a roll they're not technically allowed to make. Another notable absent one on that list is morale checks. You can no longer reroll those anymore. Perhaps does have the chance to trip people up a little bit, as it seems like a very normal and common roll to make, much like the rest of the ones on the list. And maybe other important things are things like datasheet abilities, such as Celestine being resurrected on a 2+, you can't re-roll that if she gets unlucky and gets a 1 now. Or things like vehicle explosions, if you get unlucky and you roll a 6 for your vehicle exploding in the midst of your army, I'm afraid there's no command re-rolling that to make your vehicle tactically not go up in a massive inferno. Next up, here's a relatively common error with objectives secured, and again I believe this may have been a subtle change from 8th edition that might have caught some veteran players by surprise. Objective secured is of course the ability that you can control an objective marker if you have your OBSEC squad on it, even if your opponent has more models that don't have that objective secured rule. Say for example, if we had some Necron warriors on an objective, even if there was just one of them alive, you wouldn't be able to steal it with Chaos Terminators, even if you had far more Chaos Terminators than that lone Necron warrior. It's one of the incentives to make sure you're running at least a few troops in your list. However, if both players have at least one model with objective secured on an objective, then the rule actually becomes completely meaningless, and you just revert to counting up whoever has the most models. I think this can trip people up, as I think it just feels intuitive that if you have more OBSEC models than your opponent, you sort of feel like you should have that objective, as most of the time the objective secured rule just trumps any other units and makes them irrelevant. Just as an example, if we have these 6 orcs and these 3 space marines on an objective, only one of the orc models actually has objective secured, it's just this boy on the left. The looters, as a heavy support choice, don't get it. The space marines have 3 OBSEC models on the objective, but still the orc player would win that objective whenever it's compared. That's because both sides have at least some OBSEC on it, it completely ceases to function, and the orc player has more models. It's one of the reasons that when scrapping for objectives, removing any trace of OBSEC is top priority. Finally, a rule that's ripe for being misplayed in all sorts of different ways, and one that's trips me up on occasion, are strategic reserves, which for a basic rule allowing your units to outflank the enemy really does have a surprisingly complex amount of restrictions that tend to apply on different turns. Generally it's quite common knowledge now, but not so obvious for new players maybe, but they can only ever come in on turn 2 or turn 3 in match play, unless you have some sort of rule that allows the models to start on the board and then go off the board, say in turn 3. You can't bring them in battle round 1 or 4 or 5, as it's forbidden by a special rule in the mission setup set of rules, the ones that you find in the mission pack, say Eternal War or the Grand Tournament missions. The strategic reserve rules themselves maybe don't make that very clear. For example, they say the restrictions if you come in from strategic reserve on turn 3+. Otherwise, where you can actually deploy your strategic reserves still has the potential to trip you up. The general rule is that they can come in wholly within 6 inches of the table edges and greater than 9 inches away from enemy models. However, certainly one thing that I missed from my first few games of 9th edition was that you can't measure that distance from the enemy's table edge, something that's denoted on each mission map, so it can vary between being the short edge or the long edge. You also can't set up within the enemy deployment zone on turn 2, so even if you're within 6 inches of a non-player battlefield edge, that's still going to put you back even further. On turn 3, the only thing that changes is that you now can put models in the opponent's deployment zone if desired, but still you can't measure that 6-inch range from the opposing player's board edge. Basically it brings you a little bit more flexibility if you bring them in a touch later, but obviously you're paying the price of not having them influence the game earlier. Finally, there is a bit of a trick that you can do within your own deployment zone, which is if you set up every single model within 1 inches of your own board edge, and also those models are within your own deployment zone, then you are allowed to set up within 9 inches of the enemy. This one can actually be surprisingly powerful. Say if you've got a cheap but effective melee unit in strategic reserve, if the opponent tries to push too hard into your own deployment zone, then hopefully you're going to be able to get the jump on them quite easily with that unit and deliver them into combat automatically if that's desired. You can even automatically set up within engagement range if you want, though I think usually that doesn't make sense as it'll stop you being able to shoot the enemy unit. That is quite a specific one though. You do have to make sure that there's enough room to put every single model within 1 inches of the table edge, which you might actually struggle with for any sort of large unit. So anyway, I hope a few of those helped. As I said before, please let me know if there's any other rules mistakes that you see quite commonly in game at the moment. There's loads more I could potentially talk about, but it'd be interesting to see what you come across most commonly. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep these regular 40k videos coming, with new things coming out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the content on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.